Eventually, the cultural relativism that was either the intention of the travel narratives or their effect in the minds of those already depraved and looking for a rationalization would find their way into the works like Justine. Virtue, Rodin tells one of his young victims in a moment of detumescence, is not some kind of a mode whose value is incontestable. It is simply a scheme of conduct, a way of getting along, which varies according to accidents of geography and climate, and which consequently has no reality, though which alone exhibits its futility. There is not upon the entire globe two races which are virtuous in the same manner. Hence virtue is not in any sense real, nor in any wise intrinsically good, and in no sort deserves our reverence. Sexual liberation is a conflation of enlightenment thought, which is to say, rationalization based on science, and masturbation. Masturbation was the logical outcome of Sade's incarceration. A man whose sexual activity was out of control when suddenly cut off from the objects of sexual pleasure will resort to the solitary vice. But there is more to Sade's attachment to masturbation than that, just as there is more than coincidental connection between sexual liberation and masturbation. Sade's sexual activity had essentially been masturbatory from its inception. All creatures are born isolated and with no need of one another, he wrote in Juliet. In a sexual world like this, where each sexual partner is simply an aid to orgasm, a sexual device, and an instrument for pleasure, masturbation is the theoretical essence of all sexual activity. That theory became practice when the Marquis de Sade was incarcerated in 1777. In the absence of the whores he would hire to stimulate his sexual fantasies, he was forced to create imaginary figures who would serve the same end as masturbation became his actual rather than just theoretical sexual outlet. Science, which is to say the world understood according to the philosophes' reading of Newton, makes morals and religion unnecessary. Taken in the context of Sade's writing, which is the correct context, Newtonian science becomes a justification for sexual pleasure. In fact, its only real attraction. Newtonian physics made morals unnecessary because it reduced the complexity of life and all of its moral considerations to some calculus of matter in motion. What used to be behavior that led to heaven or hell had been reduced by the Enlightenment into a few simple calculations involving fluid dynamics. In the context of both his fiction and the life he led while writing it, the Enlightenment became for the Marquis de Sade an aid to masturbation, and to a great extent as a result of his text, that is what it would remain for generations of sexual liberationists to come. By the time the internet arrived as the primary delivery vehicle for pornography 200 years later, masturbation was still the key to understanding sexual liberation because, as with Sade, the libertine invariably sees his sex partners as instruments, something which makes even sexual activity with other people essentially masturbatory. The ipsation of liberated sex is intensified by its abhorrence of procreation. His contempt for female genitalia is legendary, something which also explains his choice of sodomy as his preferred form of sexual activity. But sexual preference indicates other truths as well. Sade's misogyny may well be a disguised hatred of the mother whom he felt had abandoned him as a child, or it may have resulted from his undisguised hatred of the mother-in-law who had imprisoned him for 13 years of his life, but it also bespoke hatred of nature, female nature especially, because it was the vehicle for new life, which was, in its way, testimony to the author of life. When he wasn't confined to his cell and limited to masturbation as his only form of sexual expression, Sade invariably intended to engage in both sodomy and sexual blasphemy, typically involving the desecration of communion hosts. In both acts we see defiance of nature, which is to say defiance of the connection between love and life as ordained by the Creator. Sade's frequent use of the term nature in his pornography is equivocal, and the use of the term amounts to what Nietzsche, an avid reader of Sade, would call the transvaluation of values. Nature in its traditional sense, meaning purpose, is replaced by nature in its Enlightenment sense, which means whatever is, which is to say the absence of purpose. Nature in the latter sense commands all activity, and since this is so, there is no such thing as free will, and as a result, terms like good and evil are chimeras of a bygone age. As a result, sexual liberation becomes by its very nature a form of domination, whereby the strong get to do what they want with the weak. Since strong is synonymous with male and weak with female in Sade's anthropology, liberation means the male domination of women. Sexual liberation is therefore always a form of control, according to which the idea of nature as rational purpose, implying good and evil as expressions of practical reason, is replaced by the idea of nature as brute force. This also means that any pancultural implementation of sexual liberation will call forth a feminist reaction, as women who are imbued with left-wing fantasies first succumb to unwitting domination and then react with inchoate rage when the outlines of their bondage to liberation begins to become clear to them. Sexual liberation, as the foregoing 200-year trajectory indicates, always tends to masturbation by way of rationalization, and in this respect the Enlightenment was the crucial enabling device for sexual revolution, every bit as much as it was the enabling device for the political revolution in France. Sade played a crucial role in both events. In Justine, the explication of the true physical nature of morals, as de Holbach predicted, makes them non-functional, hence allowing liberation from moral constraint. In reality, though, the attraction of Enlightenment physiology lay not so much in its truth as in its satisfaction of desire. Sade had also seized on the work of the philosopher La Mettrie, author of L'Homme Machine, published in 1748. La Mettrie's views were in essence simple, and exercised considerable influence on the characters of Sade's fiction, if not directly on their creator. Man, according to La Mettrie, must be defined exclusively by scientific observation and experiment. The conclusion of this method can only be that a human creature is a machine, as dependent on motion as the machinery and instruments of the new scientific age of the 17th and 18th centuries had proved to be. In Justine, Sade takes de La Mettrie's idea of man as a machine to its logical sexual conclusion when he writes that, quote, women who are nothing but machines designed for voluptuousness, who ought to be nothing but targets of lust, are untrustworthy authorities whenever one has got to construct an authentic doctrine upon this kind of pleasure. This and other passages indicate that sexual liberation is a system in which behavior dictates reason, and once reason is no longer the light according to which man acts, force takes its place. And force means the sexual exploitation of women. As Sade makes perfectly clear, the inner logic of sexual liberation is always might makes right. The truth is the opinion of the powerful. The good is the desires of the powerful. Sexual liberation is, therefore, of its essence a form of control. In its nascent and crudest form, it is male control of women. Since women, according to this view, are essentially appliances who get neutered to prevent unwanted offspring from diminishing sexual pleasure, sexual liberation is also essentially masturbatory. In this regard, subsequent generations of sexual liberationists are like moths returning to the same flame, namely the seminal texts of the Marquis de Sade. They are irrationally attracted to these texts, but they dare not get too close to them lest their attraction be destroyed by the burning logic of domination which lies at their heart. The philosopher, Sade writes, using the contemporary term for the Enlightenment thinker, sates his appetites without inquiring to know what his enjoyments may cost others and without remorse. In that one phrase, Sade gives us the essential definition of sexual liberation. It is the sating of passion without remorse according to the materialist philosophy which the philosophes derive from Newtonian physics. By transforming men into machines, de la Mettrie, M-E-T-T-R-I-E, and Sade immediately transform all sex into masturbation, and once that transformation occurs, it is only a matter of time before some social engineer begins to figure out a way to put that newly liberated sexual energy to some extrinsic financial and political use. The minute after man gets liberated, he gets controlled. Materialism is not attractive because it is true because it is attractive. Its appeal is essentially erotic. Huxley, in this regard, is a more sensitive critic than Gray because he is willing to admit just how readily reason succumbs to desire and the role that Enlightenment thought played in this reversal. The philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with a problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do, or why his friends should not seize political power and govern in the way that they find most advantageous to themselves. The voluntary as opposed to the intellectual reasons for holding the doctrines of materialism, for example, may be predominantly erotic, as they were in the case of La Mettrie. See his lyrical account of the pleasures of the bed in La Volupte and at the end of L'Homme Machine, or predominantly political as they were in the case of Karl Marx. Taken in context, however, the point of these effusions is masturbation. This brings us then to the duality at the heart of the sexual liberationist project, a duality which revolves around the issue of freedom and slavery. The exoteric text of the Enlightenment and sexual liberation is liberation. Its esoteric text, however, is control. What appears on the surface to be brave Prometheans liberating themselves from the chains of superstition turns out on closer examination to be a masturbatory fantasy, which sooner or later was going to be exploited as a form of control. By proposing sexual liberation as the overthrow of the moral law, then, the Marquis de Sade simultaneously opened up a new vistas for domination for anyone who could manipulate passion.